not everyone immediately went, well, we've got to save the Constitution. Let's just take a look anyway.
After 9/11, you have to wonder, with the things that have happened in this nation and in this world, if our civil liberties have to take precedence over national security and the lives of thousands of American people.
These civil liberties come first, I believe, unless they're proven that they are a threat or they're security risks.
What's going on in America right now is kind of fear-led, and what we're doing is we're kind of undermining the constitutional abilities. The Constitution is very clear about how we detain U.S. citizens and how we don't.
I think the fears are way overdone. I think that civil liberties, we must remember where we came from.
Sure, but I mean, there is this huge constitutional question. There's this question about what America even stands for that both you and the Admiral have alluded to. And yet, though, the controversy about this bill, as far as the White House and Congress are concerned, doesn't seem to be about those issues,
right.
as far as I can tell.
It indicates, I think, the failure of our Washington institutions, both Congress's abject failure to consider the constitutional implications of its own acts, and quite frankly, the White House's abdication of its own role in the checks and balances. Congress was created by the founders of our country to check and balance executive power. And what we've seen with the Defense Authorization Act is Congress not only granting the executive every power that it has asked for, which it has done routinely over the last 10 years with the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, but now Congress has actively outflanked the executive branch in forcing upon it powers that our elected leadership actively repudiates.
And in fact, I mean, we have a clip now from the White House press secretary talking about it, because I mean, the White House did actually threaten to veto this bill, but it wasn't because of the constitutional issues necessarily. And this is what the White House press secretary said before some further language had been placed in the bill to perhaps give more of a compromise between the two sides. But this is what Jay Carney had to say.
Counterterrorism professionals from Republican and Democratic administrations, as you know, Ed, have said that the language in this bill would jeopardize our national security by restricting flexibility in our fight against al-Qaeda. Any bill that challenges or constrains the President's critical authorities to collect intelligence, incapacitate dangerous terrorists, and protect the nation would prompt his senior advisors to recommend a veto.
Admiral, I mean, does it concern you, though, that as far as this battle goes in D.C. is concerned, you've perhaps already lost the battle? I mean, all this bill really does is codify powers that the U.S. President already thinks he has. And in fact, the only reason he doesn't like the bill is because he thinks it ties his hands to take even more extreme action, perhaps.
Well, no, I disagree with that characterization. I think that what this bill does is essentially require that that terrorists be prosecuted in military commissions, and that they have to be turned over to military custody and interrogators. And basically, the president doesn't want his hands to be tied in that way. He wants to be able to use, the greatest investigative authority in the world, the FBI, and the greatest judicial system on the face of the earth, U.S. Federal courts. And so,
but are you sure it's so benign, though? I mean, some are wondering whether he's concerned that this in codifying what the limits of executive power are, he can't use more extreme measures, using the CIA, using other methods, and so forth, at his own discretion. Now there is some accountability. Now Congress is actually watching what he's doing. The executive has already presumed extraordinary powers in this time of the war on terror.
The commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, in his role as commander-in-chief, ought to have, not unlimited authority, but very broad authority to prosecute this conflict, this struggle, this war, whatever we call it, in the way that he sees fit, in consonance with the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict and a host of conventions and treaties that we have ratified. But what this does, in many respects, is force him, the United States, to deal with terrorists in a particular, or alleged terrorists, in a particular way that
Can we just pause there really quick?
is not helpful to us.
Is really important.
The tilt is toward indefinite detention, and it inhibits civil liberties.
Well,
And I don't think the president wants to do that.
You interjected that. It is quite important always to remember that what we're talking about there is the indefinite detention of people who have never actually been proven to have done anything
people
wrong.
Who are accused but not proven. We have courts for a reason, right? And checks and balances on executive power are critical to maintain liberty. And the Admiral correctly stated, I think, that the president, while correctly entitled to broad authority, should certainly not have unlimited authority, and the authority to subject U.S. citizens to indefinite military detention without access to counsel, an impartial judge, the opportunity to confront.
But again, I return to what the White House argument there was. He didn't make, Jay Carney didn't make some spirited defense of the Constitution there.
No, the White House
was talking about having Congress perhaps limit executive power in doing whatever they want, frankly. I mean, Sebastian Gorka.
But even if you look at the issues in the Constitution, there's precedence for all of these actions, whether it's President Roosevelt during World War II, whether it's one of the greatest presidents ever, Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, the suspension of habeas corpus or the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens is nothing new. The question is, do you believe we are still at war? And yes,
and the president has shown that you forget about indefinite detention of American citizens.
In the Civil War,
he's
got
killing
habeas corpus stuff down his throat.
The president has actually said that, as far as he's concerned, he can kill an American citizen in Yemen without any.
As long as they're not in the U.S. So you can militarily detain them if they're here, but you can assassinate them abroad.
But again, but from Sebastian Gorka's point of view, there, of the need for extraordinary powers, then might this not actually be the limit on the extraordinary powers that you actually rather favour for the executive to do whatever he wants, unchecked by Congress?
I am in favour of checks and balances, but the disagreement between us here seems to hinge upon whether we are in war. And yes, the courts are there for a reason. They are there to deal with normal criminal cases occurring in the U.S., which have actually been committed in the U.S., mostly by U.S. citizens. The U.S. court system was not created to deal with enemy combatants. That is why you have the Geneva Conventions, that is why you have the Hague Protocols, and that is why if you are captured in wartime as an enemy combatant, we have no obligation to release you or to give you due process. You are to be kept incommunicado in a facility for as long as the war takes. And we are still fighting this war.
We are dealing with abstractions. Please,
Admiral, go ahead.
We have almost 400 terrorists in federal prison right now who have been prosecuted by federal courts. And, military commissions have had 6 terrorists prosecuted, all of whom pled guilty except one who refused to participate in his own defense. So, I mean, in terms of what has been effective, it's clearly the federal courts.
So how about the mention of the Geneva Conventions is interesting because there's been some confusion and some surprise there that figures like Carl Levin, for example, supposed progressives, are all for this legislation. But when he was discussing it in Congress, he seemed to be suggesting that this was perhaps to give more oversight to prisoners and give them more prisoner of war status, Geneva Convention status. This is partly, as far as he's concerned, to prevent prisoners from being transferred to the CIA and being rendered to black sites and so forth. He said, should to be a member of an enemy force who's come to this nation to attack us as a member of a foreign enemy, should that person be treated according to the laws of war? The answer is yes. Carl Levin seems to think this actually will give extra oversight to prevent the government from handing people over to the CIA, having them tortured, and that's another reason perhaps why President Obama isn't terribly happy about this.
To whatever extent that may be true, I would invite members of Congress to remove the provisions that allow U.S. citizens detained within the U.S., who are presumably not enemy combatants, but will be, and this I think is what the anonymous video gets to, these will be alleged eco-terrorists. These will be people who are accused of providing material support in the form of donations to foreign charities. These are the people that we currently prosecute as terrorists. And so these, you'll notice, have very attenuated links to actual terrorism. The most common crime in the counterterrorism arena is lying to a federal agent, which absolutely has nothing to do with terrorism necessarily. And when we're talking about taking U.S. citizens, potentially prosecuted or not even prosecuted, this bill removes the need for prosecution, accused of involvement of terrorism on the basis of their First Amendment protected beliefs. We're talking about removing those individuals' right to trial and throwing away the key that this bill